Good morning. I'm Scott Katzma. I'm a member of the Northwest Cider Association board, and I'm here to introduce one of our first workshop sessions called O Captain, Mercaptan, Preventing and Prevailing Over Common Flaws. This session features the esteemed Duke of Tanks, Andrew Byers of Finnriver Farm and Cidery in Chimacum, Washington. Christine Walter, Cidermaker and owner of Bauman Century Farm and Cider in Jervis, Washington, or Oregon. And Rick Hastings, owner and cidermaker of Liberty Ciderworks in Spokane, Washington. So welcome, Andrew, Christine, and Rick.
Thank you very much. So let's see, I think we're all good. You can hear me. It's so strange to not be looking into faces, but here we are. And I wanted to talk with everybody today about like the aromatic things that come up in cider making, and especially when things go wrong. So that's what we're doing here today. And Bridget, if you would forward the screen, there we go. So thank you to my co-presenters today, and they'll each do a little bit bigger introduction of themselves. And Bridget is the executive director of the Cider Institute of North America, which is also a really valuable thing to remember in terms of if you're finding that some of the material that we're covering today, you'd like to be more savvy about it from a technical place. The Cider Institute is a great place to start. They've got classes on basic cider making, as well as the little higher level stuff and the lab and the science, the chemistry and microbiology and all of that. And they also have a really valuable tool that you can access through the Cider Institute of North America website. That's a false wheel that'll allow you to kind of identify on the outside the different aromas that you're getting, and then it like clues you in. Anyways, very valuable. So something to remember. Now, go ahead and forward, Bridget. And I just put down here a lot of those smells that none of us necessarily want to taste, or excuse me, to smell in our ciders. And when you do, there's a moment of panic, and there should be then some reflection on both how we got here, how we got to these smells, and how to prevent them in the future, or how to fix them right in the moment, if that's possible. So we're gonna go over a lot of that today, and there's some fun ones on here as I was kind of reviewing my notes from classes and experience past, and I love the baby vomit smell, and some of those other fun ones. Smoked fish, nobody wants that in their cider, and we've probably all smelled a Band-Aid or two in ciders, not our own, but probably other people's. Anyway, so we're gonna go over a couple different concepts in cider making, both like modern cider making. Andrew's going to cover that, and then Rick is going to dive into traditional cider making, and both different approaches in terms of some of these flaws. A lot of these flaws are things that in small doses, in lesser parts per million or parts per billion, they're not only acceptable, but they add to the complexity of the cider. So it's not to say that we don't want a little bit of leather and a little bit of, even a little bit of vinegar kind of essence in some of our cider styles. Maybe, well, I'm looking at my little list there, and there aren't really many that I want a lot of, but the culprits behind them, the acetaldehyde and the ethyl acetate. Like ethyl acetate is the primary ester that we find in ciders that give it its kind of characteristic winey appley aroma. Acetaldehyde can be that, green apple that we want. So these aren't all things that you're gonna say, we don't want any of that in our cider. There's a place for them. There's a place even in modern cider making for a lot of these characteristics, it's just the quantities that we need to manage. And given that a lot of this is a natural part of the process of fermentation, as we'll see, and some of it will be kind of reabsorbed by the yeast or taken up by an active fermentation, and then it's a non-issue as long as you allow the process to continue as it should and in the timing that it should proceed in. Bridget, would you forward? So I've done a couple little charts here. This next one is all the sulfur flaws, and you'll see like what you're going to smell on the left, and then what the component is, or the compound, in the second row. And then under the prevention thing, really some standard stuff that is causing most of our yeast, or most of our sulfur issues, and it's all about our yeast. It's all about nutrition and yeast assimilable nitrogen, and giving it enough oxygen and aeration during early fermentation, right after you've pitched the yeast. If you've pitched the yeast, and Rick will go into that a little bit more. And then just some of it is allowing the yeast to go through a full fermentation, and we'll come back at the end to talk more about the final column, the cure column, and kind of address what to do if you find yourself in that place. But hopefully we'll just stick right in the prevention column for most of it. So anyways, we are going to, there's one more slide that let's peek at this just for a second, just to get your brain working on what kinds of other things. These are some of the most common other faults, other aromatic faults that we'll see in ciders when things go bad. You know, you've got your mouse and your wet cardboard, and some of these are kind of irreconcilable and things you can't come back from very easily, and some of them are dramatic and need to be addressed so that you never see it again if you do ever see it. But anyways, now I'm gonna punt to Andrew, and Andrew's gonna take us through some more hands-on techniques. Thanks so much.
All right. Christine or Rick, can I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down based on the amount of cement work noise going on behind me? We're doing okay? Maybe that's the last groove they need to cut into the floor of my production hall this morning. So I just wanted to take the motion of building high-quality aromatic cider to circa 1986 with a song that's close to my heart from the Beastie Boys, and it's called Slow and Low. There's a link there. You can follow the Beastie Boys. And it's really the mantra that comes into my head every time I engage and begin to think about making contemporary hard cider. The general framework is that we want to go at lower temperatures to preserve aromatic. Yeah, I can tell. Fine. Rick, step in, give me your traditional run, and I'll go find a new location. This was unexpected for me. Can we play like that?
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Rick Hastings. I'm with Liberty Ciderworks. We've been around since like 2013 as a commercial enterprise anyway. I, many years doing stuff in the basement. And Peter Mitchell graduate and taking, I think, scientific approach to making cider and trying to understand all these things that we're talking about today. But since, the last 5 years ago, we started to take edge into, this full tilt heritage, fine cider, orchard-based cider approach, trying to build our brand around that and taking it as it comes. I mean, it's as Christina's mentioned a while back. I mean, this talk in large part is about things that can go wrong and how to, deal with it once they've done that. Whereas our approach is more preventative. Our approach, this traditional approach, is really more about making sure things don't go wrong. Can you advance the slide? Yeah, it's about less about point of production and more about a holistic approach where you're looking everything and optimizing everything and spending a lot of time over months. And hopefully by the time you get to the point where you're making the cider, it almost takes care of itself. Some of my batches actually will. I don't have to touch them, and I can come back and just kind of monitor things, and hopefully and typically things don't go wrong. That's the objective of this particular approach, and I'll run through the things that we do by way of indicating how it is we get to the kind of qualitative outcomes that we take pride in and we've won awards for. So holistic versus atomistic. I think I've made note to Andy Brennan's new book, Uncultivated, where he goes into great detail about the various, this continuum between an approach which is more about deliberate work at the end. When you have juice, it's arrived. Now, what do you do with it? Versus this more traditional approach, which where the emphasis is more holistic. Next slide. So, this approach is applicable for us. We kind of buy ourselves the latitude, the luxury, I guess, of taking this approach exclusively for our stuff. It comes at some cost. We're not the biggest on the block by any stretch of the imagination, but we kind of focused on qualitative outcomes and about expressing things that I've listed here in the bullet point, trying to express varietal character. We do an awful lot of single varietals and trying to get the most and really understand what each of those varieties that we use do, and consequently its place in blends and its place in our product lineup. We were trying our best to exhibit and showcase growing practices from the 3 main orchards we work with. We think, I'm becoming more convinced that apples and apples made and cider made in this particular fashion can express terroir, topography, soils, and climate. I'm really just blown away by some things that we're beginning to get in, say from the Yakima Valley. We have a grower there that's growing apples that like anything that I've ever experienced. And so, I think there's strong potential apples do have in expressing these things. And then microbiome, we've edged into doing all wild yeast ferments over the past few years, and so it's 100% now wild. And so those things, for us anyway, add up to the target results, which are inherently and hopefully they smell good, they taste good. Next slide. In terms of input, in terms of our process, and again, by way of our preventative approach to having problems occur that we have to treat. Varietal choice, I mentioned this earlier. I mean, knowing your apples. One of the benefits in us doing so many single varietals has been that I'm beginning to really learning, the subtleties, the pros and cons, the kinds of things that make, each varietal wonderful in its own way. The flavor and aromatics, the way that some apples have really dominant characteristics can, in even minor amounts, express in a cider blend, and learning as we go that some apples, some varietals tend to either naturally complement one another, or sometimes, you think 2 will go together and they kind of cancel each other out. It's like sometimes 1 + 1 is 3, and sometimes it's less than 2, depending on the thing. So it's a learning process for us, and it's something I think everyone's going to need to do to take this particular approach. Growing practices, all of the apples we get, almost all the apples anyway, are grown expressly for making cider. They're not intended to be sold on the shelf or used in any other way, so they are ugly as hell. Sometimes sunburnt, sometimes all those things that would make it unmarketable in any other way. But they do seem to really help in terms of outcomes, the kinds of things that I think we're targeting here through this talk. Harvest practices, I'll say, I can aver to the benefit of full maturity. I'm looking forward to the day of being able to, have it more typical than atypical, that growers are letting apples hang until they drop, doing machine harvesting or even using groundfall as they do in Europe. Because again, I'm just seeing that has real benefit in the outcomes we're looking for. Post-harvest practices, we were really careful and fastidious about sweating the apples. Each varietal seems to have its own preferences in that regard, and then sorting for really, really strong cleanliness. If we're like us, you want to steer away from using much SO2 or just letting things go. And then flavor and aromatics and yan content all seem to benefit from these post-harvest practices that I'm talking about. Next slide. And then you decide whether you want to do culture or wild. I indicated that we do wild yeast ferments exclusively, but that is something else that can be, I think, part of the profile, part of your palate in the ciders that you're producing. And as you go into just actual production, all the obvious stuff, the usual stuff, the ranges that I'm showing in terms of pH and TA, absolutely important. Yan was something that I'm not sure it's easily measured. We don't have the capacity to measure, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that I need to invest and learn how to do that. Right now, it's been observed. We see how the pace of ferments go. We advise our growers on how a particular block is doing versus another block, orchard to orchard, and it's all related to yan and the various levels of yan that we're getting from the orchards we work with. Microbial control, we try to do 0 SO2, but maybe there's certainly a fine line there between the risk factor of using none versus just a pinch, and you can sleep a little easier at night. But bricks and nutrients and temperature are all things that we monitor throughout. I think it's essential to monitor throughout. Monitoring in our terms, my approach is just what does it smell like, what does it taste like as you go. If you sense that the yeast is unhappy, we take a kind of a reactive approach, assuming that generally speaking our juice is got plenty of good quality nutrients and all the balanced the things that it needs in balance, so that the ferment will go flawlessly. But from time to time, we do notice that, in fact, this morning I was just adding a little bit of Fermate O to one of our batches because I was picking up some H2S, just, a pinch. Obviously, the yeast is a little unhappy, treat it. That's just kind of our approach. Next slide. This is, I'm not sure it has it probably does have a fair bit of effect on the outcomes, but our approach is really just a sort of a stabilization racking and then final racking. I was looking at Joe Lacour again last night. He recommends 3, but we're just kind of doing a simplified approach, and then fining as gosh, if something's gone awry and there's maybe we do have to use copper or something like that. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it is advised, and that's where Andrew's, I think, and Christine's slides can help us this morning for ways to save things and to do fining or tweaking as necessary. Next slide. I guess I'm an advocate, and I do believe that there's great benefit in terms of the qualitative outcomes in aging. This is not something a lot of ciders afford themselves the luxury of, but we do. And again, learning on how well this is going to work for depending on varietal and depending on conditions. But in terms of expressing the fruit, I'll name an example is Macintosh. We have some fairly exceptional Macintosh apples grown in our area. I know some places back east frown on Macs in general because I don't know, but ours are wonderful. But a little bit of maybe 3 months or so in bulk storage, say in a flex tank, the bit of oxidation that happens seems to really wake that apple up. And depending again on the apple or the varietal and what you're doing, what your objectives are, there sometimes can be aging can be a great way to bring out fruit character. Microbial character is another one that aging can precipitate. Malolactic fermentation, obviously. Others, if in measure, if you're monitoring and you feel like that's where you want to go. We do a fair bit of aging in barrels. Usually neutral oak. We have a couple of products where the aromatics and the flavors are pulling from a whiskey barrel kind of thing. So there's reason for that too. And we don't do much of this, but in terms of texture, which would be carbonation, again, back up to microbial output and the influence on flavor of the yeast, things like pet nat fermentations or in bottle fermentations, obviously have a place. Next slide. And then I think this is my final slide, but when you get around to blending, back to knowing your apples, what works and what doesn't, what blends, what doesn't. We do an awful lot of singles, like I said. Sometimes adding maybe 10, 15%, 5%, 2.5% of various things to kind of coax flavors in directions we want to go. And again, knowing what's going to happen with that is just going to come with experience. And I think that the benefit of working with singles helps us do that. Helps us understand when a bit of blending can be some flaws, or some, not necessarily flaws, but some shortcomings can be compensated for by other additions, and then sometimes the need is there to maybe the back sweeten a bit. We don't do much of that, but on occasion that's a benefit. But if your target is, if your self-imposed framework in terms of your approach is ours is, then all these things add up to things that I guess I would say have depth and complexity. They have lots of little flaws, or nothing big, but it becomes more of a harmonious thing, where it's the apples and all the things that tell the story of how the apples became cider and began to get to know one another in bottle, and then showed up in your glass in this complex and wonderful harmony of flavors and aromas and characteristics that come together. And that's that's been our target, and we've had pretty good luck doing that. So again, preventative, not necessarily telling you much about how to treat things that go wrong, but for that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Christine.
Hey, real quick, Rick, that was awesome. A couple questions that I think will tie in really easily to what you were just talking about. First off, Bobby asked, in shifting to wild fermentation, have you run into any trouble with wild yeast producing ethyl acetate, and have you taken any measures to avoid it? Do you want to touch that now?
I can touch that now. Yeah, it was, we were very nervous and, edging into using wild yeast ferments. We had wildly differing outcomes, the first, second, third trial, and we did lots of small trials. But as we got deeper and deeper into it, we saw the variances level out, and so these peaks and valleys became very steady, and the kinds of things that I guess I would call flaws or things that were unintentional began to go away. And I think it's really a function of the selecting the orchards, or at least having confidence in the yeast that's on the apples in those orchards, having some confidence in that, and then just beginning to do it. So I'm gonna say now that what we have is a house yeast that is born of the apples, born of the orchards that we work with, and they've taken up residence here. We definitely oxygenate our cider as we go, as we introduce it into the vats. And so I'm sure that there's a lot of our house yeast gets into the juice that way and helps us achieve the consistency. So I guess, we haven't had problems with the wild yeast since those first trials.
And then one other question that I am looking forward to the answer to. Scott asked, when you're working with the single varietals, how do you account for the potentially awkward discrepancies between your tank sizes and varying yields year to year, both in fermentation and maturation? As in, you've got 8 barrels worth of juice and a 7-barrel tank.
Oh.
What do you do with that?
Well, we work in modules. 200 liters is one, 1,000 liters is another. I work to only bring in enough to, to work with those modules. That helps. And then I know enough not to take a lot of stuff on I don't have a lot of experience with. We have a club, a cider club, where, it's just, one barrel is dedicated to that. And I can play with, 2 or 3 barrels of this particular single varietal that maybe I don't have a lot of experience with, or, so it's a relatively small amount that then either can be blended or served up straight. And then the another output, or, for us anyways, we have here a tap room where we have something called a cellar series. And so, these are in-house experiments, and they're blended to be wonderful, but not necessarily something we're going to market or create a SKU for. And so we have the ability to, to sell and learn from, see what our customers think with all those little trials. Is that answered? Is that, you think that's what the answer to the questions?
I think that's great, Rick. And then let's see. We're giving Andrew one more minute. Why don't you touch this question? How do you manage high pH must? Are you just blending sharps in? Will you ever use malic to hit a target pH if you're working with BSW BSW varietal varieties?
Bittersweet varietal, probably.
Bittersweet, yeah.
Yeah. For, I try not to make a practice of it, but if the intention is to learn from what we can about a certain varietal, and maybe I don't have sharps around, I have blended in malic to get the thing in a range where it needs to be. There's just no point in not doing it and just having an entire batch gone bad. So, I think that's the answer to the question. I'm not above doing that.
And Rick, how you mentioned oxygenating, about your the ethyl acetate. Davis Palmer wants to know how you are oxygenating.
Nothing high tech. We if it's coming right off the press, I'll use our variable our pump, and then just splash the hell out of it as it goes in. And then I think that's really all I'm doing. I'm just making sure it gets a good splash as it goes in, and filling the tanks slowly.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rick. Let's jump to Andrew now. It looks like he's got a safe space for talking and addressing. So we'll bump backwards to Andrew's slides.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Sorry for the dance here. It is always complicated in the rural technology zone. So my big reveal had to do with the slow and low mantra. And I feel like there are significant differences when we want to talk about fermentation of contemporary apples to make modern or contemporary American ciders. And the differences articulated that the ideal is to go slow and low. But there are so many things in the world pushing you to go faster and hotter, make more of it, get it out the door, because this is the continuous production cycle that meets the demand of sales, as opposed to the harvest-based model that meets the provisions of the orchard or the tank space that you have in your warehouse. Give me that next slide, if you please. Cool. I've always said contemporary American cider. Pretty sure this falls into the ACA modern category, right? And these are things that are heavily available to adjuncts. They're made primarily with dessert fruits. And just touching on what we mean by dessert fruits, right? These are things that are low in tannin content, reasonably high in sugar content, not a whole lot of character left once that sugar content is gone. So, with a few exceptions, most contemporary ciders are being made with a blend of dessert fruits, either to help build some form of complexity with multiple flavor profiles, or they're being, let's see how do you put it, you're looking for something, and whether you get that something or not depends on what you put into it. And so if you don't find it in your apples, you're going to find it in your fruit juice that you use to back sweeten, your infusions, the botanicals, the vegetables, coffee, tea, and honey. I was just going on a tangent there. Not all of those are a good idea. Okay? There's our notion of contemporary cider. Now, how we build aroma into that is really the same fermentation dynamics that Rick is talking about, but we have other constraints because we're on a time frame. So give me one more slide. The notion of temperature control. I put a huge slide with a ton of words on it because it's totally faux pas in PowerPoint land to put a bunch of words on a slide. But you all can look at this at a later point, and I wanted you to have some reference points for the white papers that articulate things that Rick was saying and the general premise of slow and low. So this is from the Pennsylvania State University Extension Office, and it references a whole bunch of cool articles and white papers that define and prove that you get better aromatic complexity when you go at lower temperatures for a slower rate of fermentation. Okay. Noting right here in the middle, the most common off flavors associated with high temperature and rapid fermentation are sulfur-derived compounds, mercaptans, disulfides, right? These are the things that we're trying to avoid, but we're also trying to meet our deadlines as contemporary cider producers. One more slide. So, I pulled some slides from AWRI because I wanted to be diplomatic in terms of sourcing information. And so I kind of went out and found a table that made pretty good sense. And this table is hard for you to see, and our slides will be available to you. And we'll have a link in just a moment that'll pop up on the next slide, and you can go look at this yourself. So my take home here is as you're leaning in to see what I'm talking about, you'll be able to find that table on a website. In red, what I printed out there is that we have these things called fining agents. Some fining agents are focused on clarity, and some fining agents focus on off aroma removal. They make your cider cleaner after you've gone and messed it up because you're racing against the clock to ferment too quickly. And so in the idea of how to approach and treat these flaws, prevention is by far the best method. If you find yourself in a pinch, you find yourself stuck with aromas or flavor profiles that are unacceptable, there are a handful of options. None of them work as well as having a healthy fermentation at a lower fermentation temperature, giving a slower rate of fermentation, right? But if you can't prevent it and you end up with it, then what do you do? And that's what this is really starting to address. We have 3 to 5 basic notions of fining agents that can help take things out of your cider. Those 5 are going to be carbon, casein, bentonite, gelatin, polyvinyl pyridine. Did I say that right? I bet I didn't. I bet there's another syllable in that one. And there's some evidence that silica and silica gels can also bind to various flavor and aroma compounds and drop them out of solution. Using these things, carbon, casein, bentonite, gelatin, you find that at small additions can really pull the negative things out of your cider softly. But if you need a large addition, then you've probably already ruined your cider. And so in that context, if a fining agent doesn't do what you need it to do, then you need to talk to 2 other folks. And those 2 folks are either the spin doctor, known as your marketing department, or it's the distiller that lives down the way. And there's really no way to get around those 2 pathways. If the fining agents, in their gentle removal of taking subtle off notes away from an unhealthy fermentation, don't get the job done, the options begin to deteriorate, and they look at either, can you find a flavor profile that you love within those flaws, within those many, many flaws, or can you talk to a distiller and turn it into some brandy for a product down the road? Again, ending up in that cul-de-sac, it's something that you can prevent by good hygiene and good yeast nutrition on the front end. And so just pushing always for the front end work as opposed to the back end work. The notion here of these same fining agents and then moving across and showing their various effectiveness at different notions. And I brought this one up because I wanted to also point out that these fining agents, whatever they may be, have multiple impacts. They don't just pull out a touch of your strange sulfur aroma, but carbon is going to strip color, and gelatin will soften, but softening is also removing tannins. And so if you have a very delicate tannin profile, which is a nice way of saying you're using dessert fruit and you don't have many tannins present, using a gelatin fining agent is going to soften and pull all of that away from you. And so there's no silver bullet that just does it perfectly. They all take a bit deeper bites than you want them to. So then my closing argument here is that the slow and low fermentation is very much the desired pathway. When you do make a mistake, sure, you have fining agents to recover. You can aerate quickly. You can drop in your carbon, but you're going to suffer. And I think that modern ciders are really adaptable to the use of fining agents and to the use of these, fixes, because so often they are dominated flavor profiles by adjuncts. And in adjuncts, we're talking those fruit juices, tannins. So if we're back building our flavor profiles with additions that aren't apple-based, additions that aren't fermentation-based, you can mask, you can cover up, you can bolster or highlight your aromatic flaws and embed them in deeper non-apple flavor profiles. But fundamentally, at that point, you're already choosing to downgrade quality and figure out how to cover something up. And I think most people can tell. Well, I take that back. I think most people at this symposium can tell, and that is going on. That is a decision that you get to make in terms of quality judgment. Do I talk to the distiller, or do I talk to do I build the flavor profile around something completely different? Those decisions become this kind of like emotional roller coaster of your cider making team. My cider making team is sitting directly in front of me out in a pavilion. I can wave at them, and they're all looking at a screen right now. What I'm talking about in terms of putting some moldy cider into bottles, because I thought it was going to get better. Well, figured no one would. But then, as it turns out, everybody noticed, and they all wanted to gag. Which takes me to my real closing argument, which is that you need to taste your cider a lot. And you need a lot of people to taste your cider, because as it turns out, I don't taste that bread mold very much. In fact, I kind of think it tastes like biscuits. I kind of like it. And as it turns out, a lot of other people pretty much gag when they taste that. When I smell hydrogen sulfide, I also think of like nice yeasty bread. Sometimes it smells a little salty to me, like I'm down by the docks, like a little anaerobic. And I start thinking about growing up next to the beach, and it's a nice, all fond memory. But it smells terrible, like foul gas of brimstone and all that to many other people. And so in that term, knowing what you can taste and what you can't taste, don't trust your own palate. Assemble yourself a team and make sure everybody believes that the flaw is as insignificant as you think it is.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Does that do, Rick? Christine?
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to give you some tools to walk away with, and one of them is using something like this. This is my Aroma Academy False Aroma Training Kit, and there's another one by Aroxa, and that's AROXA. Those are both like exposure things. You can, like, there's all these little vials, and mine actually, as I pick it up now, it's gonna smell. I can't even take it to the cidery because it smells so bad. It's got all these flaws and faults in these little jars that you do. Anyways, figure out what it is you are smelling when you smell a flaw or you sense a flaw, and educate yourself in that way. And if there's anything you can't isolate, get lab work done or do the lab work. And I'm going to give you I'm going to try and be super simple with this one, even though it's a kind of a complicated scenario. That, let's say you smell a sulfury thing and it's got, you know, maybe the cooked cabbage, or if you, Bridget, can you pull up slide, I think it's 5, the sulfur compounds? And you see like there's cooked cabbage or vegetal, you know, green beans and that sort of thing. And it's not dramatically clear. The one right before that, Bridget, it's not dramatically clear which of these it is. You know, is it dimethyl sulfide? Is it dimethyl disulfide? And interestingly enough, the way you handle them is very different, because if you were to aerate what you thought was hydrogen sulfide, and it was actually already a mercaptan, which is just further along on the metabolic chain, then you've just really, or even if it was dimethyl disulfide, you just destroyed yourself. And now you're left with something that's really difficult to get out, and that you really don't have a choice but to bring in some heavy metals and then fining, and then, you know, like a lot more volatility in the process. But if it was just hydrogen sulfide, then you could aerate. And so the tests for that are that you would first take a sample and aerate it and see if you can't get the smell to dissipate just from aeration. If you have, then it is hydrogen sulfide, and that's a much simpler fix. And you fix that, and you move on, and hope it doesn't come back in your package. Though I mean, hydrogen sulfide is naturally part of the process of fermentation. So if you're smelling it early on, that's fine. If you're smelling it 2/3 of the way through, you want it to start to be dying down at that point. And if it's not, or if it's getting worse, then you need to think about, like, is this diethyl sulfide? Is this, you know, heading towards a mono mercaptan, something like that? So if it doesn't, you know, blow off when you aerate the sample, then you can try and expose it to elemental cadmium or cadmium ions, and if that fixes it, then you're like diethyl disulfide. And if that doesn't fix it, and copper does, then you've got a mercaptan, and you need to then like go bigger guns. If you hit that place, then I like your comment, Andrew, about Shea Comfort's copper wand. That is also, like, that's how you can use a penny, you can use a piece of copper pipe. There are lots of different things. And I think I just lost my train of thought, which is shocking. That doesn't usually happen. Just kidding. Anybody who knows me knows it does all the time. But all of that to say, Bridget, can we forward now to the that last slide? You figure out what the issue is, and then there are lots of resources for figuring out how to fix it. There's a lot of great understanding to be had in this yeast book by White and Zeinchef, and a lot about understanding like the natural place of acetaldehyde and diacetyl in a fermentation that will then be taken care of and be gone. So education is key, identification, and then as you're running into issues that you have not prevented with taking care of your nutrition and cleanliness in the beginning, then don't hesitate to call your reps for your yeasts, your nutrition products. If you're more of a traditional cider maker, like Rick talked about in his process, then I would say, I mean, it's not that you then can't use the tools that like Scott Labs and Anartis and some of those other like adjunct manufacturers will certainly, like, even just the Scott Labs cider handbook is a really valuable resource for understanding a lot of the processes. But in general, we can prevent a lot of problems depending on what size of facility you have, but just by keeping things super clean, keeping your airspace minimal. And a big one I want to call out, because I didn't learn this until a couple years into my cider making, and it's fairly profound, but don't have any chlorine bleach around your facility, because the chlorine, the free chlorine, can be methylated by a fungal thing that comes in on pallets, it comes in on barrels, it comes in on cardboard. And once you get that infection, it leads to TCP, which is that awful wet cardboard, wet newspaper thing. So very preventable, something that you can easily do just with that. Like, now you know, if you didn't, don't use chlorine bleach. And then to tie back in with Andrew's comments about taking your time in fermentation if you can. And I don't know if this whole COVID thing has taught us anything, if not to just chill out a little bit, relax and take some time. So those are my best takeaways. And I'm just glancing at the comment section and see that Andrew says we can call him. That's great. I'm definitely going to call you, Andrew. I don't know why I don't do that more often. So I would love to open it up if anybody has any questions or comments that we didn't address during the bulk of our talk, or guys, if you have anything else you want to circle back on.
I did want to reach out and articulate that healthy fermentation should be the norm, and that relying on finding agents to remove your mistakes should not be your pathway to success. While we do know certain pathways exist, spreading out and getting copper of some format in there to help remove hydrogen sulfide, sure, lovely tool to have in your tool belt, but by no means is that fix in the first place. And to say that you can't get out of those tight spots, but the entirety of it is about not getting into those tight spots at the beginning.
I think that understanding that cider making is a lot like farming, in that when you create a healthy system, then the system will find its balance and will require a lot fewer inputs, and especially unnatural inputs, high chemical intervention. And similarly, like cider wants to ferment, juice wants to ferment, and it has all the tools it needs to do that. And when given, the proper container, if you will, not just tank, but like scenario, space, environment, then it will do it correctly. And even a wild fermentation will get enough of the kinetics to blow off the normally occurring in fermentation diacetyl and acetaldehyde. Those all have their place in fermentation, and under healthy circumstances, they all find their place and leave. Right? They go out the door at the time when they're supposed to go out the door. And that's the beauty of what we're doing. It's like, there's the opening quote to this yeast book is about, in the process of beer, it's not about controlling it. It's about like letting it be and letting it do all the things that it has this innate wisdom to do. So, thank you. Bridget put in there that the Cider Faults wheel is available on their website now, and it's a lovely tool. So that's, I highly recommend it. And if there's not anything else, then feel free to jump onto the stage if you want to share your picture and words. Then you can get on and talk and ask questions live if you'd like.
Covered up. I got a question. Yeah. So every once in a while I'll taste a cider and it's got this, tastes like cheese, like a sharp cheddar cheese. What the heck is that? I've never managed to do it myself. It's not that unpleasant, actually. It's kind of neat sometimes.
So a cheddar cheese, like you can get guayacal. Guayacal can have some cheesy, but it tends to be a little more like tangy, smoky cheese. There is one other, what's the cheese one? Cheese. Somewhere in my notes. Andrew, have you ever found cheese? I would almost say it might be a little Brett. Could be Brett or like indole, and that tends to be reflecting nitrogen in the fermentation. So is this in a wild ferment or like a pitched yeast?
Oh boy, I wish I could remember a specific cider that had it. Yeah. I mean, you know it if you taste it. It's like if you get a tin of Cougar Gold cheese and eat those little crystals off the top. That taste.
I want to say that I think that's a little Mercaptan, but like a
Mercaptan. I'll look that up. Thanks.
What's that?
I'll look that up.
Yeah, but again, like Mercaptans on the spectrum can add complexity and interest and are not necessarily, I mean, like maybe you don't want your cider to smell like cheddar cheese, but a little bit of like cheesiness, right? Like that's okay. I mean, who doesn't like cheese?
Taste is subjective.
Right. I'm sure Andrew would like it.
I would point out that amazing what different people can taste on different days of the week or different seasons of the year, how your body goes through cycles. So what you identify as imagining is probably something close to like garlic and sweat as far as my interpretation. Yeast come all together, and that's not classic Brett, but it is pretty awesome looking combination of lactic acid bacteria and an unhappy yeast going down that sulfur pathway. It's probably a multi-pack of issues creating the flavor profiles that we're picking up on, because if you've got one of those problems, you've probably got two or three of the others. Dysfunctional fermentations don't happen in isolation. There's a large ecosystem at play, and so when something starts to go wrong, many other creatures are also taking advantage or going wrong in their own special ways.
I'd also like to point out, while I got a microphone here, that if you ever sat behind a booth at a farmer's market in the Seattle area, you get asked if your cider is vegan. Believe it or not, you get asked that. And if you're using isinglass and a few of the other things, you cannot say yes. Right. Something to think about. I don't really care either way. I'll just say no, but that's a thing. I haven't actually used isinglass on cider now I think about it, but I have on like berry wines. It works great.
Yeah, it's much more commonly used in winemaking because of it tends to attract proteins, right? And so it's not generally it's not our best tool, isinglass. So you could keep vegan.
Heather, I had a question about apple varieties. If I was going to go out and plant a new orchard, and I'm not necessarily going to do that right now, but if I was, what kind of American apples would compete against some of the common British or European apples that we use in cider making? Like, what would you recommend would be a high value product?
I'm going to defer to Andrew and Christine in terms of great answers, but I'll tell you, I kind of think that American apples, a Harrison and a Campfield, and I can't think of too many American apples that have a lot of tannin that are really direct corollaries with something like a Chisel Jersey or something like that. And so, you said you prefaced your question with American apples. I mean, the things that I think I would love to have more of, that I've had good luck with, that I think highly of as a cider, include Harrison and Campfield, and gosh, none others are coming to mind right now. There's not that many, frankly, but American apples tend to be multi-purpose, and I think that's fine. In terms of high tannin, that's a tougher thing to get from a strictly American apple. We've used an awful lot of crab apples, crab apples that are used in orchards as pollinators, and a lot of the crabs, particularly Manchurian, have just an awful lot of tannins. And so, as an adjunct to, say, a Campfield, an adjunct to a Harrison, that's an approach that I think we might call an American approach. And I'm hearing a lot of crazy static stuff and feedback. Am I well enough, or is this?
We're good. It was Andrew. Yeah, he's back.
Okay.
Sorry, Andrew. I'm so sorry. I killed Andrew.
So Christine and Andrew, are there other American apples that you can think of that you like using? Oh, Golden Russet. Hey, I've got to mention that. That's really one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it high tannin. I wouldn't call it something. It doesn't remind me of a British apple, but it's just got amazing aromatics, amazing flavors. It just grows well where we're at, and so I would definitely consider Golden Russet.
Yeah, I use.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and then Etter's apples come to mind too. I mean, I'm not sure where they didn't come off right off the bat with his. We got access to Crimson Gold, which was one of his cast-offs, amazingly enough, but that's been used by one of our orchardists as a pollinator. And so what a happy find that was. It's a close cousin to Wixon. And so Wixon, that's another one. So
yeah.
What else, guys?
The Airly Red, Mountain Rose, that whole, apple phenomenon, the red flesh, that's pretty American, like from Corvallis area. That is one of my favorite apples of all time. Love it. And I think of crab apples as being pretty darn American. I mean, what is American? I don't know. But like crab apples have grown native and throughout, the eastern part of the US and all over. And I think they're pretty rad. So it doesn't sound very American, but those are some of my faves. Andrew?
We struggled to find bittersweets. So I think if you're focused on the lineage of American bred apples, it would make sense to be focused on a high acid profile as far as how you put your cider together, and not so much on trying to achieve something that is mimicking a French or Southern British countryside cider, and instead using what we have, you're going to craft your own profile. And so, yeah, in that world of like black twigs and wine saps and Arkansas blacks, and they might bring some interesting complexity to the table, but you're not going to be able to, grow the same, a similar style of apple and then create a similar cider. I think those complexities make it that you need to define yourself, what you're putting out there, and it's going to be unique. And it's going to be all this place-based ciders.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, I think maybe it's time for us all to go to the trade show. So thank you everyone who joined us today, and feel free to reach out to us, or maybe you'll bump up against us in the networking. I'm sure we'll all be logging into that in a bit. So have fun. Thanks for joining us.